about a couple of books that before we went live about ego is the enemy, and what's the other book that we were talking about again?
Wolfpack.
Wolfpack. Can you
Yeah.
expand on a couple of those?
Okay, so Ego is the Enemy is a great book. Shoot, I'm like bad with names. I should know who it's written by. You find that. It just kind of goes into the idea of looking at history, looking at personal experience of the author about how ego has kind of like broken down his the process of his life in some ways and how he's kind of worked through it. How acting from ego got in the way of, for instance, like Napoleon and all of these other famous leaders, and then how the lack of ego, how like moving through that ego piece has really made a difference in the in individuals' lives, but also the lives of our country or the people in our country. And then there's this other book called Wolfpack by Abby Wambach. Yeah.
Yep.
And she's soccer lady, and it's a very like leadership book from a female perspective. And I read those books right next to each other. Also, I'm not a great reader. I audiobook them. I mean, I'm embarrassed about that, but I say it out loud because like maybe other people are embarrassed that they're not big readers, but you can listen to audiobooks like me on road trips and get a lot and get, everything from them too. So I read Ego is the Enemy, and I was like, okay, I get what they're saying. It doesn't feel like it really is landing for me. But then I got more into it, and I was like translating it to work for my brain. I was like, yeah, this works for me. Then I read Wolfpack, and I was like, oh, this book speaks to me so clearly. Talks a lot of, and the difference around that was like ego for me isn't me getting out there and being like, hey guys, I'm so great, look at me. Like that is not what it looks like on me. But I think what it looks like on me is a little bit of imposter syndrome, is a little bit of perfectionist tendencies, right? Where I'm uncertain of my abilities, or like I defer to other people, right? It looks different, but I think the seeds of it is the same thing. It's looking at yourself from the outside in, and being like, how am I going to be judged? What will people see me as? And then reacting based on how others will see you, rather than more of that intrinsic, how do I want to show up for the world? What do I want to do in the world? Because I believe that it's valuable, because it's, that wholesome value, rather than how will I be seen? And so I thought that was, I'm just exploring that idea right now, because I do a lot of work on coaching education and confidence when it comes to girls and women and imposter syndrome. The idea that people maybe feel like they're imposters, even if they're high achieving, capable people, but they feel like they're not good enough. They're not like, they shouldn't be the one who's in that position. That happens with me, with a lot of different people. And, when I am an Olympic wrestler and I'm going into a high school wrestling room and being like, I don't remember how to teach a double leg. I'm like, what? If I have that feeling, what about, the mom who's come into coaching later? What about, the high school wrestler that's coming back in to help is that what they're experiencing too? And is that maybe limiting their ability to get into leadership positions, to, engage in the world in a meaningful way and give back, because, we feel like we're not good enough to be like putting something out there. And then I think the more of like the typical ego is like, I'm not good enough, but I'm just going to like put it out there because I want people to know that I am good enough, even though I'm not feeling good enough inside. I don't know.
Yeah, it's really interesting about like the differences between men and women, because this attributes to everything, especially with coaching and athletes. Because like with men, our concerns are to be respected, to be validated, to be appreciated. For women, it's to be seen, be heard, and be protected. So like it's interesting, like even the dichotomy between the balance between ego and imposter syndrome. Like for men, like the bigger issue, like the mission of this podcast is talking about violence, having candid conversations about violence, life, and martial arts. So for men, our currency has been violence. And this is systemic to like the issues about toxic masculinity, identity crisis, ego, that for men, again, dealing with ego, it's the issue of our currency is our violence, and that is predicated, our capability is based upon the violent aspect of our potentiality for violence and our quality at violence. Because with that in mind, that means that, hey, if we're good at what we do, this has the benefit reward of our other aspect that identifies for men's capability, confidence, and driven to our ego, and that is our ability to have partners, having sexual partners specifically. So men are good about the two F's. I'll save the two F's, but we can pretty much figure them out. But and again, with this issue with men is that it's conditional based, and it's really sad that our for a lot of men dealing with ego is our conditional love sets, the way that we are appreciated, the way that we're respected, and the way that we are responded to is based upon our physical capability, and often that is our violent capability, our violent potential, and our currency attached to that. When the fact is, power should be our restraint, even despite all that capability. But there has to be more to our, for men, that is, there has to be more than just our violence. It should be, we can be more about our love. It's because of love, for those who we love and those who we love to protect, is why we are capable in our violence and that potentiality to use it. But that is not intrinsic to who we are. Because as men and with our ego, we have to be more than our violence. We have to be more than what we do, and that's beyond the currency. So we're not so attached to the conditional identity of that, and that's really hard. And this is where having conversations talking about like that it's okay is important, because on the other side where that plays into is the way that we view of how we address our daughters and our wives and female partners and our athletes that are in our sphere of influence, of like saying, hey, as a man, my concerns is about my violent currency, and you, my female athlete, or just female attached to my life, that my responsibility is to protect you, when the fact is it is not my responsibility. Life and personal liberty is based upon the individual to take accountability of it. But for men, it's like it's that coded aspect of we are the protectors, which we should, as everybody should be. But for a lot of men, they have this hyper focus of saying, hey, we're the experts of violence because our currency is violence. So we're going to teach women how to deal with violence because you're dealing with violence attached to like potentiality of violence coming by way of a man. But the problem being is we come at it with a male mindset and a male's concern. And that leads to the bigger question of dealing when we're talking about self defense and personal protection for women. This issue of, from a men's perspective, it's a little skewed and a little off. And what's important is to address what is a female's perspective when it comes to dealing with violence, personal protection, and self defense, and what are their concerns of like, how do they want it to be taught? And actually, I'm just going to shut up about it because really, this is a topic that is specific for you. What are your concerns? What are your thoughts? And how do you want to address self defense, protection, and everything?
Yeah, I think this is really interesting. When you explain this, like it's a different perspective than I have experienced, and also like because you're a different person. So I think it's really interesting.
Yeah.
And I would say, and like when you I have to say there's like a little gut in me that's like, I don't want to be protected.
Yeah.
But I also have, I also have friends who like have so often like the issue of safety has been the reason why they didn't go travel here or do this.
Hmm.
And I'm like, man, I've never really experienced that.
Yep.
I have to a degree, but like not as prevalent as other people. And part of that is because, knowing what you're capable of and knowing what you're not capable of through combat sports can really buoy that sense of understanding of where you're safe and where you're not.
Hmm.
Also, the reality is that we have in common is that like we've lost people, we've lost, like
Yeah.
I've lost a friend, right? Duffy, who
Yeah.
was, like murdered, raped
Yeah.
here in Alaska,
Yep.
like, and that idea of like, oh, this like safety bubble that I just imagined I had isn't
Hmm.
as like cushy as I thought, right?
Yeah.
That extends to my athletes, to myself, to my daughter, to my sons. I mean, to everybody around, and that need for safety um, becomes, um, becomes more important. But again, like you teach somebody combat sports, and the way they walk into the room will make them a harder target than
Yeah.
somebody who doesn't understand that, right? So that physical part is so important. But the other part that helps me as a female feel more safe is understanding and knowledge,
Hmm.
and having a network and community around me that I know, how to be safe. Because, like, safety situations a lot of times are physical, like it is
Yep.
about physical safety, but a lot of times it's more about emotional safety, or like, like there's other pieces, social safety, right? Like those are all situations that our brains treat kind of the same, right? With that fight or flight, right?
Yep.
um, and so I think the added to that is that the community piece is really valuable.
Yeah.
Like, you know, when we're talking about self-defense, like that community piece is really important part of that, right?
Yeah.
So maybe I feel like I will, and the physical part is so important as well, but it's just one of the many pieces. I
Yep.
don't know if I'm really explaining this well, and please jump in with like specific
Oh,
questions.
no, this is great. So, like, the things that we talk about stress inoculation and confidence. So, to share a little bit about the motto and like ethos that I try to engender at the gym and the team, and just that I grew up with in concern to our methodology of martial arts. So, our family fighting words are memoir questum voces. In Latin, that simply means remember who you are. Every time I went into the cage, every time I went to the ring, every time that I fought, my father would tell me two things: son, I love you, and remember who you are. That is predicated, however, on knowing who you are. And that part right there is really hard for people to figure out. And still, like, almost approaching 40, I'm still trying to figure that out as well. But like building that basis of trust, of understanding, like, hey, you are part of a process, part of a tribe that helps build that confidence. Because the other side of that motto underneath the family banner was this issue about physical confidence, and we summed it up in a family quote of, "I know who I am, for I'm a warrior. I know what I can do. I know what I can do to my enemies. Therefore, I'm at peace, and there is no conflict." Now, that's powerful and painful at the same time. Where it's painful is the fact is that confidence and the idea of an enemy. Because I have an enemy, I have to be physically, emotionally all prepared to deal with violence to such a point that, even to the point of lethality, and spending a life focused on that's a lot to ask somebody. And that's a lot to ask our daughters and our wives and our sisters and our mothers, to have that mentality of saying, hey, the confidence that you have to build as an individual, to have that liberty minded self protection, that personal protection, saying, hey, you have to have the confidence to do this stuff, and capable enough, and realize that it's not just enough, you're more. That comes at a cost of the physical aspect, the mental aspect, the emotional aspect of, you have to put a lot of work in. And when I found, when I was teaching self defense and personal protection here in the community, because I used to teach a monthly 4 hour block, which was not intended as like 4 hour one and done. It was really a lot of like saying, hey, this is an introduction to it, but the work is done every day. This is just, it should be a point of inspiration and conversation. And the things that I found as a male instructor dealing with a lot of the women who came to these courses is that I'm dealing with after the fact. I'm dealing with it after the fact, if it happened to them or happened to somebody around them. And then they're coming from a point of fear. I mean, and trying to build resiliency after fear, after a damaging situation. And that's really hard. And that's really hard to carry as a man, telling women, saying, hey, we're trying to teach women saying, hey, you have to fight men, and knowing that if you have to fight men, that me as a man sharing this knowledge, even though they may be in the mental state of it, still very present in their mind because it happened to them or somebody close to them. That's really hard to carry. And there's, again, the ego in mind for a lot of men is saying, hey, I'm a man, I'm a subject matter expert, I'm big, burly, and done a lot of combat, but they don't think about the other side of it. What does a female need when it comes to personal protection, self-secure, and self-defense? And they don't have that presence of mind to say, hey, step back. And some of them don't. To step back and say, hey, let's think about the victimhood aspect and preparation and the mindset. And that's really hard to teach and really hard to process. And I don't know if we have a simple solution, because if it's simple, everybody would do it. But that is something I think culturally that there's a big shift. And this is where programs like Wrestle Like a Girl and having female athletes who become coaches and successful in the end are really important to show that, hey, it is a generational change and that it can be done. And it doesn't have to be done the hard way every time. So, is that something that you've experienced or can speak
Yeah,
to?
I mean, I'll try to speak to it some.
Yeah,
So, I mean, like, there's so much there, right?
yeah,
I would say that there's a lot of people that are drawn to wrestling, a lot of women who are drawn to wrestling who maybe have had, physical trauma in their past, maybe a lot of
yeah,
people in general who are drawn to combat sports because, you know, it's a way of reclaiming the ownership of, their body, their space, and their power.
yeah,
And it can be a kind of traumatic, it can be a traumatic experience, right?
yeah,
To engage in that. Some people are ready for that and some people are not. And, kind of supporting people to understand where they're at is important. I think, like, just because you can, this might be the solution, it might not be the solution at that time. So recognizing it takes time to heal. There's we work with an organization called Beat the Streets, and they're really good. They work with a lot of refugees. They work mostly in inner city uh, wrestling programs in Los Angeles, Chicago, New York, and they do a lot of trauma informed coaching. And I
yeah,
think that trauma is a really big piece of this because it rewires the brain,
yeah,
and and it's such a process to work through that. And I think that as like, we're just learning to understand what trauma is and how it shows up. And as a coach, we might not even have that skill set. We might not even have that training, but all of a sudden you're like front lines working with somebody's trauma.
yep,
Right. And as they're going through it in a kind of intense situation. And I think that, you know, um, and then maybe we have our own traumas, that interact with that as well, our own backgrounds and stories that make it us either more capable or make it harder for us to deal with it, or kind of both at the same time. And
yep,
so I don't know exactly what the answer is, but I do think that exploring that and being present and recognizing that, like what you were saying before, it's not the destination, it's definitely the journey that is the important piece of that.
yep,
um yeah. And then more of like, maybe like some like harder kind of, like more
yeah,
like tangible. I work with a woman who does this, she calls it empowered mindset self-defense, and she talks a lot about
yeah,
situational awareness.
yep,
Her name's Stacy Mitri, and she's like super cool. She was the first female FBI SWAT team
yeah,
members. And
yep,
yeah, she's very cool. She did an online course, and what I find that what and I've seen her court. I've seen her teach that so many times. I get something more from it each time. And, I grew up in a bubble here in Homer thinking that I
yeah,
was safe, just skipping around the world. And, with these past years, that bubble has definitely been popped.
Yeah.
And I have had to figure out, how do I engage in the world that's not always going to be a safe place for me? How do I send my kids out into the world and not like be like, no, no, you know what? I'm always going to be there, right there to protect you. Like, how do you trust the world, and also keep yourself safe? And I think that we get to practice that when we do sports. We get to practice that when we do, you know, when we engage in the way that you're talking about engaging. And it's not going to be pretty sometimes, and you maybe not even get it right perfectly, but to have those conversations, you know, to recognize when people are in more of that trauma response. You know, it might look like crying, it might look like yelling, it might look like a little bit of an anxiety attack. You know, I worked with a girl a few years ago, who like had an anxiety attack during a tournament,
Yep.
and it was, you know, and what we did was one of the, you know, one of those mindfulness practices of like, let's take some deep breaths. Like, tell me like 5 things that you can see. Tell me 4 things
Mhm.
that you can hear. You know, right? Those things that bring you back into your body.
Yep.
Try to find those tools and be able to utilize them with your athletes is really important. And it's something that I'm still um, working on as well. And then also bringing in resources. We did a wrestling camp a few years ago, and there were some topics that we wanted to talk about that could have been very heavy.
Yeah.
And we were going to have some mental health professionals during those sessions be available, and then they
Yep.
didn't show up, and we didn't open it up. We didn't have that session. Did it need to happen? Yes. Would
Yep.
we have been able to support that session if somebody had some real trauma? And I would say probably there was a lot of opportunity. And so we just didn't have it because it wasn't the right time, and we didn't have that foundation to support. And I think that, you know, it's that balance between being like, oh, I'm not going to touch this, or I'm going to go like deep into it. We have to do it in an intentional way that we make sure that as we're picking the scabs, we're supporting as we go forward with tools, with resources, with education, with outside support. Yeah.
Yeah, it's definitely more than a 4 hour Saturday afternoon workshop. It's a lifetime process of trying to figure out ourselves and all these things. And that's for coaching, we're more than just teaching the technique. We touch the lives of our athletes, and they touch our lives in return because we spend so much time. And a big subject that I'm constantly approaching and constantly working on my own writing, and I bring it to this podcast, is talking about vicarious traumatization as a coach and compassion fatigue. Because when you get to know people, you get to know them, you get to know their truths, their knowledge, and the weight of the responsibility of having that information. If you, the coach, are not prepared for it, that will be devastating. And in the case of myself, I speak about this all the time. When I was coaching, I was not ready. I had not done the work because I had my own trauma I was processing through, a lifelong trauma. And I thought by externally, by the ego, by displacement, that I could help people process it because I had shared the experiences, but I actually had not done the work. And in the process of doing that, the weight of knowledge crushed me in such a level that, I mean, I had my break in my sobriety, a tremendous break. I had my suicide attempt. I shut down the gym. I mean, there was a whole bunch of things that had got attached to it because I had not done the work to take on the work of others, and that's important. And some people, it crushes them entirely. And I'm very fortunate that I didn't, and I was given the time and space to process through that and still process it and be better educated on it. But part of that is like talking about it. So from an aspect, this is where conversations like this is really important. I find for the community is this aspect of, as coaches, addressing that we are not everything underneath the sun. We are human. We don't know all the answers, and that's okay. But as coaches, we need to talk about these hard things like dealing with vicarious trauma of our athletes and dealing with compassion fatigue when we get burnt out by all that knowledge. and that one understanding that it's not ours to carry, even though we are compassionate and we love our athletes, it's not our burden. We can be in supportive, but it's not our responsibility. But we can be in supportive, and understanding those boundaries is really important. And questions I ask other great coaches is knowing that issue, because as every coach knows, it's a prevalent part of being a coach. How do we, or by extension, as another coach, how do you address those issues with dealing with vicarious trauma and compassion fatigue, temporarily holding it and then releasing it without it becoming damaging and damning for yourself?
Mhm. I think that's a really important topic to talk about, and I definitely I'm there with you for sure. I when my kids were really young, I uh, worked with the Independent Living Center program, and there were some times that like
Yeah.
I like would go and I would care and I would try to support, and then I would go home and I just I couldn't do it. Like I did not like I am a caring, loving person, and I
Yeah.
ran out of caring. I'm like gonna not care about these people at my job who are depending on me, or I'm not gonna care about my kids. Like, where is that, right? And
Yeah.
so like I found early on that I have a capacity, and if I go beyond that capacity, I'm kind of worthless to the people around me, and it eats up at myself. So like I think I dealt with like the physical, like I had some like adrenal things, and like
Hmm.
like I had and it physically affected me because I just couldn't do that. And I think that maybe a lot of people I didn't like maybe feel have experienced similar things as that. Um, it's my doggies. Um, uh, it's like such an old saying that you have to put your mask on before you help
Yeah.
other people, but it's so true. You have to do that, and it's very important as a coach. You have to have really clear, firm boundaries, right? You can walk with people and let them lean on you, and then you need to go back and like support yourself and build your reserves back up so you can go and do it at the next day. But if you don't do that, you can't show up the next day, right?
Yeah.
um, really understanding, especially as somebody who's experienced probably a lot of trauma. When you experience a lot of trauma, a lot of times they say that that's actually what makes you an empath, to be able to really feel other people's experiences.
Yeah.
I don't know. I've heard that perhaps it's true, perhaps it's not, but there's a truth to it.
Yeah.
And, and, and again, it can be really triggering to your own experiences. And all of a sudden, you're trying to carry the weight of somebody else, and also all of the weight of your own past experiences are coming up. And I think awareness is really important, but also um, being very like being um, not only conscious, but um, like adamant to support your own well-being is the only way you actually can make a big difference in the world around you sustainably, right?
Yep.
Yeah. So, I feel you. I think that's important. Uh, um, as I'm getting older, I learn a little bit more about that, of like some of the things I can help carry something for a little bit, but then I need to give it back, because me
Yep.
carrying somebody else's challenges doesn't solve their challenges. It like almost inhibits them developing and going to the next level. But it's scary, especially when um, you're supporting people who um, like are going through really difficult times. So
Yeah, because
uh,
we love the people who we love, and we love those who are around us that are part of our journey. And we want to share in their successes, and we want to show up for them for their failures. But again, it's still their individual journey, because at the end of all things, our experiences are our own. Even though we share them with other people, the responsibility of those experiences are not up to us by third party. And like talking about the mindfulness about recharging our emotional batteries so we don't succumb to compassion fatigue, so we can have a use a technical term, a larger window of emotional tolerance to deal with those things is really important. And yeah, addressing that as an athlete, just addressing it as a coach is really important. But even further, addressing that as humans, as people in a society where we're constantly dealing with relationships, in any regard, however deep or however small, is really important. But and this is where I find that again, addressing trauma and like the information that we have received over the course of the past 20 years, because there's been some significant change in the past 20 years, having open discussions about this and not just talking about it, but actually finding means and methods is really important to help adding tools to the toolbox to make us better, well-rounded human beings on and off the mat. And and this is where podcasts and conversation like this is really important because I know from generations before, they knew about this stuff, they had thought about it, but they didn't talk about it. And it was very much the toughen up, show up, and if you're going to play rough, toughen up mentality. And that only lasts for so long. And I think we can be more than that. And this is where stuff like this is really important. So, and I'm glad you are part of that system of change, and those around you that are involved with are part of that system of change so we can be better coaches, better parents, better people for those around us so we don't have those shortcomings for those who fall in between the cracks. Because I mean there's a few people that will, but hopefully by means we will help raise the average there of better successes on and off the mat.
Yeah,
So
100%. And I just want to really point out that I recognize that it's an even more difficult topic. This topic is even more difficult for the men in the world than it is for the women in the world, because
yeah,
that willingness to be vulnerable and to, you know, uh, to break up, to like stop that. I will just persevere forward.
yeah,
That's more accepted for women than it is for men. And so the fact that you're willing to talk about this, because it's not a like female versus male experience, it's a human experience that we need to like process and develop and grow through these challenging situations, and we have to acknowledge it in order to do that. The fact that you are doing that personally, and then also publicly for the people, for the people that you work with around you, that's really doing good work in the world. So
thank you. I
I
appreciate
just
that.
want to say good job and thank you.
Because
Yeah.
the idea of the wolf pack and the lone wolf is an interesting little dichotomy. Because the fact is, men have this idea of the lone wolf mentality. The fact is, the lone wolf dies alone. The wolf pack is strong, to use that metaphor, and it requires the tribe, the wolf pack, to unite and support of that individual, so we can be better in the long run. Because being alone and being isolated, that's a lonely road, and it's leads to so much failure and that interdependence or that singular dependence on self. And that leads again back to ego. But the fact is, we go to a mechanic when we don't know how to fix our truck. We go to the dentist when we need to fix our teeth. It is fair to say we go to the therapist when we don't know how to fix our emotions, how to parent that inner child. And it's becoming socially acceptable. It's just there's still more work to be done there. Because like
Yeah.
talked about like the accountability of these things and the emotional weight. Like the accountability that I carry, talking about one of the shared situations that we have in this community, talking about Duffy, is the man that did that heinous crime to her was one of my athletes. He was part of my gym. He was part of some of the programs that were there. That man came to my home often because he was dating one of my staff members. Now I had no idea that he was capable or all these things. Things I had like checked the box of saying like, oh okay, I'm gonna help him out because he's a fellow veteran. I'm gonna help him out because he came. We're trying to like help him start over because he came at suggestion from people that are part of the gym. He was dating one of my staff members, so like those windows of like acceptance were already there, but I had no idea. And being a quote unquote professional self defense combative personal protection instructor who is a subject matter expert in these things, apparently I'm not very good because I had no idea. And it wasn't until like you find out afterwards and like, ah, shit, this dude was involved with so many people that I was. entrusted to with the custody and time and sharing space with, like, I had no idea. And carrying that hurts because it's like I really wonder as a coach after the fact of like getting lost in the weeds of like, what else did I miss? And obviously I missed a lot. And I know I missed a lot because me as a coach was not 100% present at the gym because I was dealing with all my own issues, my own insecurities, my own drama, my own trauma, my own issues with sobriety, all those things I talk about all the time because I had not done the work. And also, the fact is, I'm still human and I still make mistakes. But carrying that and making that a defining trait is damaging.
Mm-hmm.
Acknowledging those facts and doing better the next time, that's work. But that comes at the surrendering of the ego. And for a lot of men, acknowledging our faults and surrendering the ego, especially when it's a field that we're supposed to be the experts in, is really hard. And but in the process of acknowledging that and moving on for recovery, I hope that by hearing things like this, other men, other women, just people in general can say that it's okay. We make mistakes, and it's not our responsibility unless it was, but it's okay, and we just move on and move to something better. So,
Yeah.
but yeah.
I think that your process is really fair,
Yeah.
fair to the situation and fair to yourself. Like, um, I I mean, it must have been awful. Like the thing that you fight against was, you know,
Was in my door, was in
within,
my home. Yeah.
yeah, um, and it's and it's so real, but also like you don't know what you don't know,
Yeah.
right? And you can adjust in the future, but you can't go back and change the past. And
Yeah.
you wouldn't have known how to change the past in the past anyhow.
Yeah.
So
I didn't have
yeah.
the tools.
Hmm.
I did not
And
have the tools.
yeah, yeah. Oh, no,
Heavy.
I mean, I feel,
Deep.
yeah,
Yeah.
I feel like there's a situation where I was coaching a kid who ended up later in his um, life doing like being pretty violent
Yeah.
situation. And I'm like, wait, now I look back and I see like, oh, there's some signs. There is this, like, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
I didn't know that would have been part of like, I just feel like that sort of responsibility. And of course, you can't change what you didn't know and but you can change, we can change how we move forward.
Yep.
And like carrying that guilt is not valuable, it's not useful, but carrying that fire um, evolving, that's valuable, that's what we can do, right?
Yep.
um, yeah, I
Well, going
think
back,
yeah, I had checked in
going.
with them more often. Like we just can't
Yeah.
do that. We just have to be like, well, how do we show up the next day? And that's, we're such imperfect people. I mean, we're just so imperfect as humans. And we just don't know everything. And when we just recognize that we're not going to be perfect, we're not like we aren't all that our ego tells us that we are, or we're not. Like
Yep.
we just are who we are. Move forward from that.
To use a coaching analogy, we learn from our losses. I mean,
Yes.
I'm going to say it again. We learn from our losses. And that is more true in the situation of how we address things as adults, dealing with other people. Is like we take that loss, we take the knee of like that gut check of, I was wrong. I failed at that situation. That doesn't mean I'm a failure as a human being, but I failed at that situation. So I can either just wallow in my guilt and my failure, or I can learn from it and go on. So again, it's to use a boxing analogy, to use a wrestling analogy, all those analogies. It's not about how hard you get knocked down to the mat or to the ground. It's a matter of when you get up. And even if you still take that loss, it's showing up for the practice, putting in the work, and being driven to do better the next time. But that comes from learning from the loss. And this is where I'm finding my life now that I am trying to learn from my losses so I can be a better person than I was before. Because if I still stay in the same space, I'm not doing anything, and none of this is of value. And so I have to do more. I have to learn from those losses. But that comes at a lot of work. And that goes back to like self defense and personal protection. A lot of people want the quick fixes. They want the a 4 hour seminar where they're empowered and they get techniques when they realize the truth is it's work. You have to put in the daily work, build that mindfulness, that mindset, and have those honest conversations with yourself, even beyond self-defense, but even just like mindfulness and well-being and all these things, that it's work, but the work is worthwhile. Because if it was easy, everybody would do it. And if it
Mhm.
was easy, we wouldn't have these social issues in the first place. And if it was easy and everybody did it and we didn't have these social issues, we wouldn't have the breadth of interesting experiences to draw from and this beautiful tapestry that is the human condition. Because the human condition comes at the behest of a lot of art. No, as a result of a lot of art, but at the behest of a lot of pain, a lot of trauma. And that pain and trauma is powerful, but it can be purposeful. And this is where I feel like coaches like yourself and myself and others that join us in these kind of conversations have taken a lot of that pain and turned it to purpose and made it powerful. And hopefully, the next generation will build up on that power and will be enlightened and released from that history of pain. And that cycle will either stop or something new and beautiful come out of it. So,
Mhm. Yeah, I've been working with a good friend of mine who is, working through some tough stuff, and I'm like,
yeah,
you're working through this, but it's not like you didn't make this challenging situation in your life.
yeah,
You are the one that's experiencing it, but this is like a collective issue
yeah,
that you experience, but and it's not easy, right? But as this person heals and works through this experience, she's also doing collective good for um,
yeah,
addressing that issue as well for the
yeah,
collective. So, I mean, I don't know. That's how I see it. Yeah.
yeah, which is great. And yeah, and I really appreciate you coming on here. For one, having the resiliency, the confidence, and the trust that go in these conversations, these spaces with me, and and have the vulnerability to share it with our community in general. And that's leadership, flat out. A coach is a leader, but the coach is the leader because not because they're in charge, it's because they've put the time and effort and done the hard work to show that despite this idea of they're supposed to be infallible, but in fact they're actually very flawed. But they're willing to share their flaws with others, and so they'll in hopes that they'll become better as a result of it. And I want to celebrate you for taking the time to have this conversation with me and to share this with our community. So thank you.